to the annual Duncan Tanner Memorial Lecture, and an especially warm welcome to today's speaker, Dr. Charlotte Riley. I'd also like to offer a very warm welcome as ever to Christine Tanner, Duncan's wife. It's always a pleasure to see you again, Christine, whether it's walking the dogs or whether it's at this annual event. It's always a pleasure to see you. For those who don't know, Duncan was a Professor of Modern History here at Bangor and one of the youngest professors at the time. His research focused mainly on the Labour Party, and he gained a justified international reputation for his research. However, what many of us remember is the way he helped and supported all of us with our own research and with publications. He was an incredibly generous man with his time and with his support, and he influenced many of us over the years, such as myself, Andrew Edwards, and Diana. Diana's here today as well. And in doing so, I think he helped us all to become better academics. So I think you'd be really pleased with today's speaker, Dr. Charlotte Riley. Like Charlotte, Duncan's research interests besides the Labour Party included gender and many other aspects of 20th century British political, social and cultural history. Charlotte, by way of introduction, Charlotte was awarded her PhD in 2013 by UCL with the wonderfully titled Monstrous Predatory Vampires and Beneficent Fairy Godmothers, British Post-War Colonial Development in Africa. An excellent title, Charlotte. She's now a lecturer at Southampton University, and she's already published a series of chapters, an edited volume, and a number of important articles, including most recently this year, Powerful Men, Failing Upwards, the Aid Industry and the Me Too Movement. And it's Labour and overseas aid that has been one of the central elements in her research. So today, I'm delighted to say that Charlotte will be speaking about A Moral Crusade or Nothing, the Labour Party, overseas aid and questions of morality. So that's over to you, and thank you, Charlotte, for delivering this paper today.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that introduction. And I'd like to also say thank you to Andrew and to Josh and to Neris for helping us to, or for organising this lecture. I'm really honoured to have been asked to deliver the Duncan Tanner Memorial Lecture, and I'd be really interested to talk with you all after the paper about kind of questions and ideas that you have about this research and about this topic. I'm just going to share my screen and put my slides up. There we go, and hopefully everyone can see that. So the title of my paper, as Peter said, is A Moral Crusade or Nothing, the Labour Party, Overseas Aid and Questions of Morality. And this is a topic which came sort of out of my PhD research, which focused, with its slightly frivolous title, which focused on the Attlee government's approach to colonial development in Africa during the kind of that immediate post-war moment. And explored some of the ways in which the Labour Party sort of navigated colonial development and the politics of development and aid, whilst also trying to reconstruct the country at home and to build the welfare state. When many people within the Labour Party had been historically incredibly critical of imperialism, but also Labour actually had quite a long history of engaging with imperialism and colonialism overseas. So that kind of difficulty of navigating kind of home and colonial factors, and also kind of holding the party together on quite a controversial topic. And I think the paper that I'm giving today also sort of touches on those themes. And I think any paper that anybody gives on the Labour Party ends up being about trying to hold together the party with lots of disparate ideas and factions within it. And overseas aid, I think, is another one of those topics. So I wanted to start this paper with three quotations from what I think are three quite important, quite kind of key thinkers in the Labour Party and in the development of the Labour Party's ideology around overseas aid and development. So the first of these is Denis Healey, from a speech that he wrote actually for Morgan Phillips, which was delivered at the Labour Party, Denis Healey, in a speech he gave himself at the Labour Party conference on the 1st of October 1970. And this is part of a kind of longer and quite excoriating speech that Healey is giving. I'm sorry, there's an ice cream fan outside my flat, but it should disappear quite soon. And he said, if anybody in this conference is tempted to luxuriate in the irresponsible impotence of opposition rather than sear his knuckles and sometimes his conscience in the hard graft of government responsibility, I hope he will remember that when Labour loses offices in Britain, it affects not only us here, it affects millions around the world. The second quotation I wanted to pull up was one by Neil Kinnock, a speech that he gave at Labour Party conference in October 1985. And as I'll talk about, this is the theme that he comes back to repeatedly, actually, in his writing and thinking. For us as democratic socialists, there can be no retreat from our duties as citizens of the world. And as people who believe that the great privilege of strength is the power that it gives to help people who are not strong, we understand where our obligations are. If morality won't convince people, if ethics won't, let the practicalities convince them. And then the third quotation I have here is from a third thinker who I come back to again and again. And this quotation, in fact, I come back to particularly again and again in terms of what it tells us about the Labour Party's approach to overseas aid and development. And that's Bridget Jones, who in her diary in 1997, just before Blair is elected, says, it is perfectly obvious that Labour stands for sharing, kindness, gays, single mothers and Nelson Mandela, as opposed to braying bossy men having affairs with everyone, shag, 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 left, right and centre, and going off to the Ritz in Paris, then telling all the presenters off on the Today programme. It is important to vote for the principle of the thing, not on the itsy bitsy details about this percent or that percent. And in this paper today, I'm going to think about the connection between these three quotations and how we could get to a point where Bridget Jones could make this claim about the Labour Party, that the Labour Party is essentially a party of ethics. So in October 1962, standing before conference attendees in Brighton, Harold Wilson famously defined the Labour Party as a moral crusade or nothing. This morality at the heart of the party, I would argue, shaped its electoral ambitions. As Wilson said, the party would not sail into power under any flags of convenience, such as those that he thought might be afforded by a timorous and defeatist Lib-Lab pact. Rather, Labour would be elected to govern on one basis only, to seek a majority on a socialist mandate. Wilson's speech to conference the following year is obviously more famous. His 1963 speech is the speech in which he invokes the white heat of technological revolution, positions the Labour Party as the party of the future. It's often seen as being quite instrumental in their victory the next year. But in October 1964, at the first conference after this narrow electoral victory, Wilson did not repeat the white heat refrain. Instead, he called back to another theme in his speech. He said, in my speech at Scarborough, I said there is no standing aside, no comforting refuge in abstentions or vetoes. We are either against oppression or we condone it. In these issues, there can be no neutrals, no escape. In this shrinking world, while political isolationism invites danger and economic isolationism invites bankruptcy, moral isolationism invites contempt. And he went on to argue that the Labour government needed to take a strong stand against racism at home and abroad, because this party of ours is more than a political organisation. It is a crusade, or it would be better that it did not exist. So I think sometimes we don't think of Harold Wilson's politics as being particularly connected to the idea of a moral crusade, given his reputation sometimes as something of a, quote, unprincipled prime minister, as the political scientist Kevin Hickson has called him. And there's sort of general sense that the lessons for Labour from Wilson's tenure as party leader is the idea of kind of pragmatism and forward thinking. But actually, I think ideology figured in Wilson's political life really importantly. It wasn't just socialism in the abstract, but the Labour Party actually specifically that was imbued with a sense of moral righteousness for Wilson. He wanted the party to win elections, obviously, in order to gain power, but the rejection of flags of convenience, it wasn't just about rejecting the kind of realities of governing in coalition. He thought that Labour's destiny was to bring socialism to Britain, and that the morality of the party's mission was part of that. The connection between socialist politics and moral authority for Wilson, I think, can be read through a religious lens. He was raised Baptist. At university, he famously joined the evangelical Oxford group rather than the Oxford Labour Party. And when he eventually joined Labour in Huddersfield, he said he had done so because Labour stood for his highest moral and religious ideals. Indeed, Wilson paraphrased Acts 17:26 in his argument for an anti-racist politics at home and overseas. He said, "He hath made of one blood all nations to dwell upon the earth." Morgan Phillips's assertion that the Labour Party owed as much to Methodism as Marx is often highlighted by the right of the party. It's a pithy line that was supposedly coined by Dennis Healey for a speech by Morgan Phillips at the Socialist International Conference in Copenhagen in 1953. Keir Hardie argued that socialism was at bottom a question of ethics or morals. Robert Blatchford, the socialist campaigner and journalist, argued that socialism was ethically right, and it was this ethical dimension that should drive the left further than mere collectivism. And it's clear that for many on the left, particularly at the beginning of the century, their socialism was rooted in a form of Christian socialism. And this has been explored quite a lot by people who've looked at things like the Labour churches, for example, at the end of the 19th century, or in work drawing out the connections between pacifism and the left in Britain during the First World War, which often has a kind of religious dimension to it. But there's a distinct lack of scholarship that centres moral questions in the work of the Labour Party in the 20th century. There's not been very much academic scholarship that has sought to broadly explain the conflation between a sense of moral and ethical rightness and the Labour Party, which clearly exists among sections of the British public and can be seen in popular culture to the extent shown in the quotation from Bridget Jones' diary that I featured on the slide. Why is it possible to assert, as Bridget does, that Labour is the party of sharing, kindness, gays, single mothers and Nelson Mandela, to broad understanding, if not agreement, by readers both within and without the party? So I'm not going to explore the entire question of the connections between morality and socialism or ethics in the Labour Party in this paper, because that's a huge topic. But I'm going to focus on one aspect that is very close, as Peter said, to my research interests, and also I think explains the inclusion of Nelson Mandela on the end of Bridget Jones's list there, which is the question of foreign aid, in the context of broader discussions about Labour and Britain's approach to the global South. In this discussion, and in the paper, I'm going to focus particularly on the 60s and the 1990s. I did some work on this, as I said, on the 1940s in my PhD research, and I'd be happy to talk about that in the questions. But in this paper, I'm going to trace a line from sort of Barbara Castle to Robin Cook to show a continuity of thinking about overseas aid within the Labour Party from the end of empire to the end of the 20th century. And people working in political economy and philosophy have explored some of the ethical questions around foreign aid and assertions of moral goodness. And it's something that interests researchers quite a lot, I think, because of the sort of way that people think about charity and aid and how they relate to people's kind of personal feelings about what is right. Tomohisa Hatatori, for example, has argued that multilateral aid agencies can be kind of effectively interpreted within Aristotelian virtue ethics. And liberal justifications for foreign aid often make a kind of ethical claim for aid. They often argue that aid is necessary, that government should do something because it is right, because it's fundamentally the right thing to do. The idea that humanitarianism is in itself inherently ethical or morally good has been challenged a lot by the work of historians of humanitarianism, who have outlined some of the very complex connections between the humanitarian and the political, and between charity, altruism, national identity, and national interest. And so historians like Emily Bourne, Eleanor Davy, Tahila Sasson, for example, have done quite a lot to kind of pick apart some of the quite lazy claims to ethical goodness in the humanitarian sector. But historians in this field have also spent a lot of time pointing out the connections between imperialism and humanitarianism, and have argued that aid can't be extricated from imperialism ideologically or practically. But I would argue that political actors on the left still try to engage with questions around aid within an ethical framework, and sort of ignore those connections in a way. And I think the ethical framework that Labour uses is key to explaining how the party is able to embrace aid as a policy, despite the very complex roots of aid and development programmes in Britain. So thinking about how Labour has positioned overseas aid as a moral component of its policy platform can help us to explore how the party deals with, or sometimes I think fails to deal with, these complexities. But I think it can also help us to take seriously the idea that morality does shape voters' political engagement. I think if morality wasn't seen as an aim in Labour Party policy, foreign aid wouldn't be presented to voters so frequently as a moral good. And I'm going to show you how that's done in a bit. And I think this helps us to think about how the people who vote Labour think about the Labour Party. You know, how do they think about it as something which has an ethical dimension? So As I've already argued, modern and contemporary aid and development policies can only be understood within a framework of imperial and decolonisation policies. And building on the work of people like Anna Bocking-Welch, I think that British aid and development programmes in the mid-century moment were a way of maintaining international networks and connections at moments when this connection looked like it might be broken through decolonisation. Government aid and development programmes have their origins in colonial policies, just as international aid and development NGOs are rooted in charitable responses to imperialism, like missionary activity in the 18th and 19th century. The European metropoles at the end of the Second World War shift to what's called a sort of developmentalist approach to imperialism, and actors like the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the Food and Agricultural Organization start to become much more important players in transnational politics. And this all kind of drives an aid sector that becomes increasingly transnational. And it moves away from straightforward sort of philanthropy and charity to a more sort of technical idea about development. And there's quite a lot of kind of ways of thinking about the history of the Labour Party and their role in foreign aid. So the first Colonial and Welfare Act was passed in 1940 by Malcolm MacDonald, who was the son of the former Labour leader and Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald, and a fairly pioneering wartime colonial secretary. The Act was renewed in 1945 under the newly elected Attlee government, and several more times into the 50s and 60s. Arthur Creech-Jones, who you can see on the slide there in a really kind of leaning against a globe in a very sort of fake casual way in that photograph, was colonial secretary for much of the Attlee government, and had been one of the founding members of the Fabian Colonial Bureau, which is the part of the Fabian Society that dealt with colonial issues. And he was influential in pushing the Colonial Office to embrace social welfare programmes as well as economic development strategies. So he focused a lot on things like primary education, the provision of maternity and child health services, and the formation of trade unions for African workers. And in the middle, there's a front cover of a pamphlet by a woman called Rita Hindon, who was a really important figure in the Fabian Colonial Bureau, and sort of generally on the left in this period. She also edited socialist commentary. She wrote the introduction to Must Labour Lose. She's quite a big figure in the Labour Party, but did a lot of writing and thinking about socialism and imperialism. From 1961 to 64, under the Conservative government led by Harold Macmillan, the Department of Technical Cooperation was responsible for technical assistance to foreign countries. And then there's the Commonwealth Relations Office and the Foreign Office. When Harold Wilson is elected in 1964, they combine all of these functions into the Department of Overseas Development. And Barbara Castle becomes the first minister for overseas development, and there's a photograph of her there in her office. The Overseas Development Ministry, the ODM, was the first time that British overseas aid was delivered to a generalised set of recipients overseas, rather than being called something like colonial development or Commonwealth development. But British aid policy in the 60s clearly demonstrated a continuation of attitudes and approaches that was forged in colonial rule. And in this way, the former metropole is able to maintain its relationship with former colonies through overseas aid and development. And in many ways, I think the 60s is really a continuation a lot of the time of the 40s, of the work that the Fabians are doing, of the work that Arthur Creech-Jones is doing. Although in many ways I would argue that Barbara Castle set the tone for a lot of post-colonial British aid programmes, and not just because I've spent a lot of time researching Barbara Castle and I've ended up becoming quite fond of her. The first minister of the ODM, was not the final word in British overseas aid and development policy. When Edward Heath is elected in 1970, he rolls up the Overseas Development Ministry into the Foreign Office. He moves it into the Foreign Office, Foreign and Commonwealth Office. In 1974, Wilson is re-elected and Labour re-establishes the ODM as a separate ministry, with Judith Hart, Frank Judd and then Reginald Prentice serving as Ministers for Overseas Development. In 1979, Thatcher is elected, and the Conservative Party rolls up the ODM again and creates the Overseas Development Administration, which is subsumed entirely within the FCO and which is not a cabinet position. Then in 1997, Tony Blair creates the Department for International Development, or DFID. DFID survived the coalition government of 2010 and the initial subsequent Conservative governments, despite figures such as Priti Patel, who had called for the department to be closed during the election campaign, but then later served as Secretary of State for International Development. In September 2020, last year, it was announced by Boris Johnson that DFID was to be closed, with aid again becoming part of the FCO, now renamed the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And I think you can see by this kind of handing of aid from a sort of independent department under Labour into a Foreign Office kind of section under the Conservatives, that aid and development clearly is a partisan issue in British politics, and that Labour and the Conservatives obviously have quite a distinctive approach to aid because they can't agree on how aid should be administered. And Labour seems to be quite committed historically to separating aid from the Foreign Office and seeing it as an independent department. And so how then can we kind of think about this in the context of sort of moral duties or ethical concerns? When Dennis Healey derided those who would luxuriate in the irresponsible impetus of opposition rather than risk their knuckles and conscience in government in the 1970 conference speech that I quoted at the beginning of this talk, he did so by appealing to their sense of global responsibility. When Healey said angrily that a Labour loss affects not only us here, it affects millions around the world, he was making the claim that the Labour Party had a particular approach to foreign policy. Labour being in power made a difference even to those who were not part of Britain. And this counters a kind of, there's a tendency in IR that asserts that British foreign policy isn't partisan, and that the Foreign Office is the thing that really controls foreign policy, and that Labour and the Conservatives really have very similar foreign policy and you can't separate it. But I would argue, and historians like Rhiannon Vickers would argue, that actually Labour has traditionally, because it has kind of internationalist meta principles, it has traditionally had a different view about foreign policy than the Conservative Party has. Rhiannon Vickers concludes that Labour has never really been able to operate a socialist foreign policy because most of its allies aren't socialist. But I don't think this has stopped the party from framing aspects of foreign policy as inherently socialist or kind of Labourite. And I think Labour voters and members actually have quite a clear sense themselves of what a Labour foreign policy should look like, and they have a sense of that being different from a Conservative foreign policy. And I think overseas aid and development policies have a particular salience within this imagination. One factor in this, I think, is the fact that a lot of people, when they think about foreign aid, tend to sort of mash it all together with humanitarian assistance and think about it very generally as being kind of things that sort of do-gooding, things that are good things that are done in the developing world. Most people who support the idea of government aid, a mass observation directive found in 2008, cited projects focused on individuals and or communities and the provision of particular resources, for example, schools or access to water. And these are things that DFID does as part of its official development assistance fund, but actually NGOs do a lot of this work, and NGOs probably do more of this work. But British people, when they think about foreign aid, think about things like building schools. And that's why the people who support aid support it. And I think this blurring of categories is important because it demonstrates that a lot of British people see government aid and development policies as acts of international altruism. They don't see them as things that are kind of part of foreign policy or part of strategic concerns. They think about them as charity. But this is partisan. When polled, Labour supporters are much more likely to support aid spending to reduce global poverty. And Labour supporters are actually less likely to support aid spending if it's used for things that might impact Britain's economic self-interest. And it's the other way around for Conservative voters. So they're more likely to support aid spending if it would be beneficial for Britain's economic self-interest. When Healey made the speech that I've just quoted, he'd just come back from a trip to apartheid South Africa. And he told the conference he'd spent a week traveling around the country, speaking to opponents of apartheid drawn from all different kind of groups in South Africa. He said he'd spoken to Black people, to white people, to trade unionists, professors, churchmen and journalists. And he'd spoken to them about their experience of apartheid and also their experience of resisting apartheid. And he invoked these people again in the speech to justify his assertion that Labour needed to win at home in order to do good overseas. He said, "There is one thing on which all those men and women told me they had united. When the news reached them at the end of June of the defeat of Harold Wilson's government, they felt it as a bitter personal tragedy and a blow for freedom in South Africa as a whole." Now, this might sound like a useful rhetorical device merely being used to galvanise the Labour Party to resist luxuriating in opposition, and perhaps it was. You know, perhaps these people did not say this to Healey at all. Perhaps he just wants to get the conference hall riled up. But that type of response is supported by the global response to the election of the Wilson government in 1964, so the election 6 years earlier, and the appointment of Barbara Castle as Minister for Overseas Development. Castle had been quite active in the anti-apartheid movement. She received the Oliver Tambo Medal in 2004 for recognition of her work, and she had been instrumental too in exposing the Holocamp atrocity in Parliament in 1959. In addition, her brother Tristan, who was always known as Jimmy, slightly confusingly, Betts, was appointed Oxfam's first African field director in 1961. And so Castle was known internationally as having a long-standing interest in issues of development and having good connections with post-colonial politics and groups. And when she was made Minister of Overseas Development in 1964, she got letters of congratulations from all around the globe, including letters from actors involved with the anti-apartheid movement. So, for example, Arthur Goldreich, who was an Israeli South African artist and an anti-apartheid stalwart campaigner, wrote, "I'm quite certain you and your party are to stay for years and years, and that Britain and the rest of the world will benefit from it. I wish South Africa fell under mantle of your ministry." Similarly, as you can see on the slide, Barney Desai, who was from the South African Colour People's Congress, believed that the victory of Labour, Mr Wilson's election to the premiership, and the inclusions of persons of your fibre in the government of the UK give us great hope that justice and morality will replace expediency and self-interest in Britain's dealings with South Africa. And these are just two letters, but there's quite a significant chunk of them actually in a folder in her archive of people involved with the anti-apartheid movement, specifically invoking her appointment as Minister of Overseas Development as being a good thing for their movement. The international community, I think in this case, is receiving and amplifying the idea that a specific Labour approach, and that perhaps particular figures within the party, that they have a particular approach to colonial and post-colonial policy, and that this approach is rooted fundamentally in a distinctive moral framework. You can see Barney Desai here talks about justice and morality as being a marker of Labour's approach to apartheid. So I think for many British politicians and members of the public, aid and development were mechanisms by which Britain could maintain a global role, even as decolonisation reduced the size of the formal empire. As well as formally through hard power, they also represented new terms of engagement for ordinary British people with a new post-imperial world. This continued desire for an international role by both government and people had multiple overlapping motivations. It might have been a desire to continue empire by other means. It might have been a desire to recapture British greatness. It might have been a desire to maintain connections in areas now looking to either the USA or the USSR in the Cold War battle for hearts and minds. And we see those types of feelings, particularly in government, particularly in the Foreign Office. There's a lot of concern, for example, that aid and development is needed to stop once British colonies turning to America as their kind of international alignment. These types of arguments are mostly, but not only, to be found on the right of the political spectrum, and I'm including within that actually the right of the Labour Party. An opinion piece from January 1964 in the Sunday Times is a good example of this approach. The leader says, "Overseas aid was a matter both of duty as an ex-colonial power and of self-interest as a central figure in the pattern of Commonwealth partnerships. Aid may not in the short run buy off communism, subversion, or other forms of extremism, but in the long run, it is probably the best contribution towards the stability of new countries." So that's the kind of, practical argument for aid. Many people on the British political left argue for aid and development from a slightly different perspective. And rather than this kind of practical argument, they focus more on duty to the colonies or a debt incurred to recently independent nations. Labour figures including Harold Wilson, Barbara Castle, and also Judith Hart believe that aid was a way in which Britain could and should work to reduce global poverty and inequality, especially as these inequalities were injustices that the imperial system had heightened and codified. In Harold Wilson's 1953 book, The War on World Poverty, he set out what he saw as Britain's duty in a world where the gunboat has given way to the tractor, the proconsul to the imperial engineer. Wilson's conception of a modern world was one in which, even in 1953, in his book, he writes that imperialism is now over. Right? Imperialism is done, he thinks, in 1953. Instead, he wanted Britain and America to work together to build on post-war development initiatives like the British colonial development programs that I talked about briefly at the beginning of this talk, and also the American Point 4 plan. And He wanted to do that within the context of an international authority on development through the United Nations. And interestingly, he explicitly says he wants cooperation with the Soviet Union on this policy as well. He thinks this is something that the global North, quite widely construed, should be doing together to help the global South. At the end of the book, though, he argues that if other countries can't be convinced in this, a new Labour government should go it alone, that this should be a central tenet of Labour Party policy. He rooted Labour's commitment to overseas aid in what he said was the 50 years march out of industrialism and inequality towards social justice and the welfare state. The war on world poverty of the book's title was he argued, Britain's historic mission, partly because hunger is a threat to world peace, partly because it's a limit on global productivity, but mostly because this is an ethical challenge. He says, this is not a question of self-interest or power politics. It is a moral imperative. We are rich and they are poor, and it is our duty to help them. Judith Hart, who first served as Minister of Overseas Development in 1969 and then did 2 stints in the 1970s, also formulated a conception of overseas aid that made a moral case for Labour supporting these sorts of policies. There's a picture of her on the slide, and you can see she's actually joined an anti-government protest which is criticising cuts to government aid spending in this photograph. She's standing at the front of it in the fur coat. She wrote a book called Aid and Liberation, a socialist study of aid politics, and she wrote this in 1973. And in this book, she rejected the idea that aid should be framed through, the quotation I've put on the slide, the suffocating and cosy political neutralism of well-meaning compassion. She framed her own experience of British aid policy through the work of the Hazelmere Group, which was a non-partisan organisation which comprised a mix of NGOs and other charities, which had in 1968 drawn attention to the failures of the international aid regime. The Hazelmere Declaration is a really interesting document, and if you're interested in these kind of questions and haven't read it, I would urge that you do read it. They described international aid as, at best, a wholly inadequate payment for goods received, at worst another name for the continued exploitation of poor countries by the rich, and demanded that charities stop being polite, respectable and ineffective, and instead demand that Western governments respond realistically to the desperate human need of the poor world. Hart argued that the aid system had limitations, but this shouldn't be used by Britain as an excuse. Britain should not evade the responsibility and guilt that any former imperial power must bear for the pattern of past events, this is a quote from her, which produced the poverty gap. Instead, she said that a socialist government needed a new working definition of aid that prioritised public sector mechanisms for development over privatised solutions, for example, just as it would do at home. And she's not the only person. Barbara Castle does this quite a lot as well, who, and Arthur Creech-Jones actually really explicitly connects aid policy overseas to welfare policies at home and really kind of talks about stuff in the same kind of language, and often in the same sort of sections of leaflets and things. They kind of directly and deliberately link them. And at the final quote on the slide there, I've said, she argues that Britain under a Labour government must accept a moral and political commitment to the development of the Third World because of the universality of the fight against poverty and injustice. And, you know, aid therefore is not simply an aspect of British foreign policy, it is a moral duty, and it is one that people within the Labour Party feel it has a distinct responsibility. Another Sunday Times leader from 1969 amplified this notion that aid was distinctly a Labour policy. So I think this is interesting because, you know, the Sunday Times has picked up on this and writes a piece which clearly implies that the Labour Party is associated with aid distinctively. The piece's headline, "Let the People Give," and argues there are few votes in overseas aid, but support for it has always been a distinctive feature of Labour's philosophy. The issue is close to the soul, so to speak, of the party. They then slightly unusually describe Labour as pulsating with idealism on the issue, which is quite an odd phrase to use. But again, the idea, I think, of aid being connected to the soul of the Labour Party is quite interesting and quite important. And this invocation of the party's soul, however self-consciously, shows how the idea of aid and charity had become part of a broader discussion about the moral economy of international relations by the late 60s. Now, of course, the Labour Party's aid policy is somewhat interrupted by their election loss in 1970. They're re-elected in 1975. They continue their early policies and tone, but against an ever more fractious political background, not least ever more fractious Labour Party, that pushes discussions about overseas aid out of the spotlight. Labour itself is, of course, pushed into the shadows from 1979 to 1997. And so it has this very long period of opposition. And in this very long period of opposition, the party's natural supporters directed their energies into a really broad range of civil and civic activism beyond parliamentary politics. An enormous amount of this was kind of focused on the developing world. I think there was an enormous kind of shift in the 1980s in particular by people who had been supporters of the Labour Party into kind of thinking globally about these issues. So the Nestle baby milk scandal, for example, which became a very important campaign, the campaign around the contraceptive injection depot Provera, and of course the events of Band-Aid and Live Aid in response to the Ethiopian famine. Tahila Sasson, for example, has demonstrated how War on Want, the NGO, was able to mobilise consumers within a moral economy that connected consumer ethics to questions of poverty and morality, leading to the rise of the fair trade movement in this period. And the rise of the charity shop, which Tahila Sasson has also written about and is writing about in her forthcoming book, is also really interesting here. The idea of the charity shop as becoming sort of shifting from being somewhere that you could shop if you were yourself in need to somewhere that you could shop to demonstrate your commitment to morality and ethics. You know, you could go to Oxfam and buy things that had been produced in the developing world, and it was a way of kind of showing your commitment to this international charity. And on the slide, I've got kind of 3 examples of this. So I've got Oxfam's Hungry for Change launch in 1984, which is a very famous kind of campaign that they ran. In the middle, I've got a youth CND poster from around 1982, which is actually about Reagan's missiles, American missiles being stationed in Britain. And the slogan, which is ever so slightly cut off there, says, "Even madness think it's madness. Madness CND and millions of British people don't want American cruise missiles." And you've got madness on the poster wearing their CND t-shirts. And then a copy of Spare Rib, which is taken from an article I've recently written, which looks at the way that Spare Rib responded to the International Women's Year conferences in 1975, 1980 and 1985. And I argue that British feminist movements in the 70s and 80s, which are often seen as quite parochial and insular, often seen as being kind of quite focused with British, kind of very specific British concerns around things like socialism and kind of particularly kind of middle class concerns, actually were quite international in their focus. And you can see here on the front page of this issue of Spare Rib from April 1979, for example, that the 3rd story on the front is Eritrean women at war, and the bottom story is a latest splash about immigration tests to Britain. So you can see that, you know, Spare Rib, a feminist magazine, also has this kind of international context here. The popular mobilisation of British care about people of the Third World could be part of mass culture, for example, in the increasingly ubiquitous charity single, which Lucy Robinson has written about in a really interesting way. But I think it's also a distinct presence in left-wing activist spaces, where it takes on a particularly critical tone to explore the intersections between political and moral questions. And I've said, you know, particularly, for example, in Spare Rib. As prefigured by the Hazelmere Declaration, against the radical ideological backdrop of Thatcherism, British humanitarian aid and development NGOs like Oxfam, War on Want, the Campaign Against the Arms Trade and the World Development Movement became both increasingly explicitly political and became increasingly critical of the British government. And actually, you know, and received enormous levels of attack from the Thatcher government from becoming increasingly political. And they also became increasingly willing to mobilise British citizens in support of their campaigns, particularly through letter writing and through the lobbying of constituency MPs. So Oxfam became very used to asking people to write to their MP to sort of lobby for Oxfam's concerns. And this can, of course, be set within a much wider internationalist focus on the activist left, like the Greenham Common protests and the establishment of the Greenham Common camp. And there arises, I think, in the 1980s, a sort of holistic political identity that connected, for example, donating to Oxfam, listening to musicians associated with the Red Wedge Collective, reading Spare Rib, going on CND marches and voting for Labour. And I think it's within that framework that Bridget Jones constructs her theory of Labour's political and moral identity, which kind of mashes together quite a lot of those different things. So the 1997 Labour manifesto declared that the party believed Britain had a clear moral responsibility to combat global poverty and inequality. The manifesto declared the intention to reinstate a Department for International Development independent of the Foreign Office. So DFID, the creation of DFID is obviously in the manifesto. It focused to a large extent on the potential for aid and development as enacted through trade agreements and the European Union. So it's quite cautious, actually, the 97 manifesto, in terms of how it frames what Labour will be doing. DFID is created in May 1997 and was headed until her resignation in 2003 by Claire Short. And as an aside, I think it's quite interesting how more women have been aid and development minister in whatever it's called than any other policy apart from education. It is a really feminized role, and I think because it is seen as something to do with care, and it's also an easy way to get women into a space that's is foreign facing, so it makes you look good. But it's a role that's seen as being a caring role, a globally caring role. When Castle was overseas development, she was described as like the great mother and things like this, and it's really a really kind of maternalized role, and I've done a little bit of writing on this, but it's something I want to kind of develop more. And DFID gets, highlighted a lot as one of Labour Party's, one of Tony Blair's big successes. So you often hear, DFID and the minimum wage and Sure Start, being kind of reeled off as the things that Blair did. But it shouldn't be understood, I think, only as an invention of Blair's new government. In fact, it needs to be seen within the context not only of the history I've outlined here, the 40s and the 60s, but actually the 80s and the 90s, when Neil Kinnock sought to refocus the party after successive defeats to the Conservatives. And I think aid and development is actually interestingly central to the offer made by Kinnock to the electorate, which speaks to the importance of aid and development within a new moral framework of Labour politics. It allowed Britain to position itself on the world stage as an ethical actor, at least until proven otherwise in other areas of foreign policy. And it was an area in which Britain had historic, or in fact, imperial experience. It was a way for a country, therefore, to maintain an authoritative and dominant role in international organisations and on the world stage. But this, I think, would not have been accepted within the Labour Party or by its supporters if it had been this visibly cynical. Aid as soft power is, after all, the consistent manifesto promise of the Conservative Party. Labour's commitment to aid had to be seen to go beyond these strategic concerns. And building on the politics of the 60s, Labour in the 80s framed their commitment to foreign aid as an unmistakably moral concern. So at the Labour conference in 1985, Kinnock spoke to his fellow democratic socialists of the need to commit to, not retreat from, their duties as citizens of the world. He spoke of the obligations that a strong nation such as Britain had to help poorer nations, and argued that part of Britain's place in the world, which is quite a contested concept after decolonisation, was not only to give the poor the means to feed and clothe themselves, but also to develop their economy to find their freedom. And he frames this partly as a practical concern in Britain's material interests. So we live together or we decay separately. Quite an emotive way, actually, of making quite a practical point. But the practical concern was presented only as the last resort. So he says that we make this practical argument only if the morality won't convince people, if ethics won't. So he thinks, your primary draw to aid and development should be about morality and ethics. And if you can't win over people like that, you should talk about the practicalities of it. The Labour report, Modern Britain in a Modern World for the Good of All, from that year reiterated that aid was a moral duty for Britain under Labour as part of the party's plans for a modern Britain in a modern world. A Labour Party talking points pamphlet on overseas aid, Britain's place in the world, from the following year described aid again as a moral obligation. And I've been told that Kinnock's wife is actually quite influential in this, and obviously she goes on to have quite a role in international organisations as well. And I've been, that actually, she has quite an influential role in kind of shaping Kinnock's thinking on this as well. So these kind of thoughts, I think, have, as part of the longer context of the creation of DFID, in May 1997, only 12 days after the election, Robin Cook, who was of course the very newly appointed Foreign Secretary, made a speech to outline the core principles which would underpin Labour's activities overseas. Cook argued that in the age of internationalism and a world in which nation states are interdependent, foreign policy was not independent from domestic policy, but a central part of any political programme. The speech is best remembered for Cook's assertion that Labour needed to follow an ethical foreign policy. He never actually used this phrase to describe his plans for the Foreign Office. He actually used the much more watered down idea that British foreign policy must have an ethical dimension, which is somewhat more limited. But I think this statement can best be understood in the context of the final words of the speech, which proclaimed that the new mission statement would, quote, once again make Britain a force for good in the world. This rhetoric harks back to an imagined past of British greatness, and combined with the focus on British power lying within its position in the international community, can be seen as a repudiation of British foreign policy in the 80s under Thatcher. In fact, Cook clearly locates Labour's approach to foreign policy in opposition to the policies followed under the previous 18 years of Conservative rule, which he describes as the pursuit of not so splendid isolation. So in this way, aid and development programmes are presented as part of a British return not to a glorious past of greatness, there's nothing quite so triumphant or tinged with imperialism, but to its rightful moral position on the world stage. And this emphasis of the ethics of foreign policy was really amplified in the discussion of DFID within the Labour Party. So in the House of Commons, for example, when they have the debate on the creation of DFID, Claire Short stands up and she says ethics will be at the heart of our international development policy, obviously kind of echoing the sort of idea that Cook had set out. But this is then later repeated by other Labour MPs. Julia Drown, the MP for Swindon South, proclaims herself to be proud to be part of the Labour Party because of its commitment to reverse the increase in the polarities of wealth and to give prominence to development issues. Una King, who at this point was MP for Bethnal Green and Bow, argued that Labour was offering fairness, not favours internationally, as well as domestically, and emphasised the role of government action in international development. She said, we cannot privatise the problems facing the planet, which is an interesting callback to Judith Hart's arguments about using kind of the public sector as a development process. So overseas aid and development, therefore, I think was framed as a moral issue in this way as well. So Labour has historically used narratives around overseas development and aid to construct an image of itself as a moral actor in the world. For the Attlee government, and especially for Arthur Creech-Jones, colonial development policies were an ethical way of British being imperialists. For the Blair government, overseas development was an ethical way of having a foreign policy in the developing world. Under Wilson and Kinnock, Labour Party thinking bridged the gap between imperialism and overseas development using the framework of morality, of duty and ethics. And I should, I think to conclude, point out that to make the argument I'm making, which is that Labour has developed a sense of aid as a moral obligation, is not to argue that Labour policies towards the global south should be above criticism, or that I think that their policies are sort of inherently moral. Historically, for the Labour Party, it is clear that aid and development has been a way of engaging with the developing world without having to engage with the history of violent exploitation that characterised Britain's historic relationship with these populations. But it's also a way of denying that the Labour Party itself had any complicity in this history. They're always talking about how we will take the country into this moral future. We will restore Britain to its moral position. In this manner, Claire Short was able to claim in a letter to the Zimbabwean agricultural minister in 1997 that the Blair government was, quote, a new government with diverse backgrounds without links to formal colonial interests. And she says, indeed, that as she was Irish, she was herself colonised, not coloniser. Even whilst in the same letter, so she uses this claim that Labour has no connection to imperialism because we're a diverse new government. She uses that claim to refuse to support reparative land acquisition programmes in Zimbabwe, which were themselves rooted fundamentally in Britain's recent colonial past. She basically refuses to give any more funding for these policies because she says that the Labour cabinet have no personal responsibility for this. In 2017, the Labour Party published a policy paper, and this is the party under Corbyn, written by Kate Osamore is her position as Shadow Secretary of State for International Development, entitled A World for the Many, Not the Few, the Labour Party's Vision for International Development. So the document's obviously drawing on some of the motifs of Labour's very popular Corbynite manifesto for the many, not the few, to set out a socialist internationalist approach to aid. The document took a rights-based approach to poverty reduction and politicised problems such as poverty, hunger, inequality, injustice and climate change as both interconnected and, quote, not natural. Surprisingly, perhaps, given the kind of Corbynite context of its creation, it lauds 1997 as a radical and revolutionary moment because of the creation of DFID. And it repeats this argument for an ethical foreign policy. And I do find it interesting how non-critically it repeats these ideas, given the sort of opposition more broadly of the Corbyn party to kind of Blairite legacies. But it argues in 1997, DFID rejected aid as an idea of short-term national interest and establishes, quote, a higher moral purpose of poverty reduction, to which they argue, a Corbyn Labour government would return. This invocation again of aid as a moral issue demonstrates the lasting impact of discussions of the 60s and 90s on British politics today. As I've argued throughout this talk, aid and development policies are an integral part of Labour ideology. I would argue almost essential to the Labour Party's identity as the welfare state at home. Questions of morality and overseas aid have been historically developed and discussed by Labour thinkers, and there is a coherent and consistent canon of Labour thinking on this issue which should not be ignored or downplayed. And we might perhaps think that future Labour governments, in a world which is clearly no less unequal than that which was surveyed by Harold Wilson in 1953, should be empowered by the fact that Labour's most successful leaders have been those who have advocated quite clearly and openly for overseas aid spending, and should continue to make a case for aid, not just for short-term political gain, but as a part of the moral framework of the Labour Party itself. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much for listening. I'm really happy to take any questions now, and I think you can either type them into the chat and Josh will read them out, or you can use the raise hand function. And I think Josh is going to share the Q&A, and I'm going to unshare my screen as well.
Thank you very much for that, Charlotte. As Charlotte said, there are two ways that you can verbalise any questions you have for her. If you click on your raise hand button, you can verbalise them directly to Charlotte, or if not, I'm happy to read them out if they've been put in the comment box. Oh, we have a first question already from Mark. He says, how did Labour politicians translate their impartiality, ideas and debates about morality into the party's political appeals during elections? Was the language used within the Labour Party different to that used when communicating with voters? And did this change over the post-war period?
So that's a really interesting question, and I'm going to answer like generally and then a specific example about Barbara Castle. So generally, I think it does shift because obviously the stuff in the 1940s, this is still being presented very much about imperialism, and it's presented often about it's a way for Labour to navigate with its voters the idea that Labour has an ambiguous position on empire, and particularly that Labour supporters in the 1940s perhaps have an ambiguous position on empire. So they use talking about development to kind of they do use this language of morality to sort of talk about why it's important that Labour should get into power for the colonies, because they need to continue to be able to do these things. By 1997, as I said, the 1997 manifesto is actually, weirdly, considering how much the mythology of the Labour Party is, differed as this wonderful revolutionary moment, the actual 97 manifesto is really focused on, like, we will work with the EU, we will do work with international organisations, which of course is really important in terms of situating Labour as part of the international community, which I think is intended, as I said in the talk, as a rebuke to Conservatives who were seen as sort of not being willing to work with them. But it's not quite, it doesn't spend quite as much time as I had expected actually before I read it on kind of talking specifically about what Britain would do, how Britain would do these things, again, sort of as part of morality. As a particular person, Barbara Castle, I find really interesting on this because I've read her electoral addresses, so the leaflets that she was putting through doors in her constituency to be elected and re-elected. And she talks about aid all the time, and she does it often by making this connection between socialism at home and aid overseas. So she says, for example, I'm committed to aid because as a socialist, I think we need to have a policy of from each according to their ability and to each according to their need. And she says something like foreign aid is that socialist axiom on a world stage. And so, and this, this is talking directly to her voters on the leaflets that she's giving them and on posters and things like that. She's talking about that, really tightly connecting kind of socialism, morality, aid, and kind of welfare, and connecting them all together. So it is a little bit different sometimes, but I think it's still quite visible in the communications that they're giving to voters. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Charlotte. We've got a question from Stefan as well.
Yeah, some of the language was quite passionate, and this brings me to the question, were there opponents in the Labour Party who may not have said, we don't want to give money, but who may have said, well, it's not really one of our key priorities, we should first go for something else?
There are, and that tends to be more associated with the right of the party generally. And there are also opponents sort of who make that kind of argument, but also arguments about practicalities as well. So like when Labour is in power, there's often quite a lot of cabinet discussion about securing aid budgets. And like, again, Castle kind of has quite impassioned arguments in cabinet about trying to get the Treasury to commit enough money, for example, partly because she's become very attached to the idea of hitting a 1% GDP as British aid spending. And that's an interesting discussion because a lot of the rest of the people in cabinet, particularly the Chancellor of the Exchequer, for example, are not convinced that that 1% target is something that's worthwhile Britain spending money on. And she keeps trying to make this case that this, this is about the sort of duty that we have to the overseas to developing world, but it's also about kind of making commitments, and it's about us being able to demonstrate that we can do these things. And it's the Treasury sort of goes, well, that sounds lovely, but we don't think that that's something we want to spend money on. I haven't found so much evidence of this. I mean, I've looked a little bit at discussions around the writing of manifestos, but probably could do that more to think about how this is kind of discussions about whether to put this into manifestos and things like that. But certainly when Labour is in government, there are arguments about this, but it does tend to go somewhat on a left-right spectrum within the party. The left are always kind of obviously more keen on this.
Thanks again. Alexander.
Okay. Thank you, Charlotte, for a fascinating talk. I wonder what role do intra-party discussions and debates and competing claims for this superior morality play in all this? I'm thinking in particular of politicians of the Tony Benn type, with their challenge to Kinnock and then subsequently to Blair, and his claim there might be an even better Labour Party that is even more moral, which would live up to those standards that are now basically being not lived up to under those much more interest-driven politicians, power politicians.
Definitely. Ben is a really interesting example of this, and I think Michael Foot is an interesting example as well. So that moment in the 1980s where you have a very clear divide within the party, and then obviously eventually Kinnock is kind of successful and ends up kind of pulling the party into the centre. Tony Benn, for example, I've read some of his writing where he was, in order to make this case for morality and in order to kind of engage with these questions of aid, actually, I read loads of stuff where he was really critical of the Fabian, he was very critical of people who said that the Fabian Colonial Bureau had been an important force in Labour's international politics. Because he says, no, the Fabian Colonial Party, they're Fabians and they're centrists and they're too, gradualist, and they were never as, we were more radical than that. We have a more radical history than this. We don't need to give all of the credit to these people. I don't think I really agree with him. I think the Fabian Colonial Bureau was really, really quite dominant in the 40s and 50s. And actually the Labour Party, on colonial issues, it's the FCB start doing this work and then the Labour Party kind of catches up. But Ben's definitely really keen to kind of rehabilitate the history of the Labour Party in order to make this argument that we should be more radical here, we should be more dominant. And one of the ways that this comes across, and I think also comes across a little under Blair, and I think you can see it actually in the way that Una King's intervention, where she talks about not privatising the problems that face the planet, and her kind of post-politics political trajectory as well. There's obviously a left-wing critique of aid, which is that, aid is neoliberalism. Particularly aid which is granted with strings attached is deeply problematic. Of course, the kind of cancel the debt policies, for example, and things like this, the drop the debt policies. And I could have talked actually in the paper about kind of Gordon Brown's decision to cancel debt and how that kind of feeds into these narratives as well. There's definitely a group on the left of the party who are critical of any kind of government aid spending which is done in any way which looks not only critical of any idea that aid could be self-interested, but also critical of any idea that aid should be anything other than no strings attached cash, which of course is actually the policy of quite a lot of aid NGOs now as well. Actually, cash transfers are the most effective thing. that's one of the reasons why I find the Corbyn document so interesting, because I was really surprised when I read it that they were so positive about DFID and that they hailed DFID as revolutionary, which I would have thought that a kind of Corbynite position on DFID actually would have been, you know, DFID is merely a Blairite neoliberal organ which seeks to, you know, support companies like the CDC PLC, which is a British government company which seeks investment opportunities in the developing world. You know, I would have thought they'd be far more critical of things like the conflict fund, for example, which Britain spends a lot of its ODA money on. I would have thought they would be more critical of ODA generally, actually, as a, you know, and actually they really embrace this self-mythology of, you know, DFID is this wonderful radical moment and isn't this wonderful and altruistic and socialist. So I think it's interesting. I think there clearly is a lot of capacity for people on the left to be very critical of this. Sometimes that works in sort of reworking Labour Party history in order to make Labour look more radical than it was historically, and sometimes that works in them kind of, yeah, making claims and trying to push the party over to the left. Or it might often also come out in the fact that they're also doing work with other organisations. A lot of Labour MPs who are, you know, even Judith Hart actually, who was Minister for Overseas Development, but is also, you know, very well known for the Chilean solidarity campaign work that she was doing and things like this. I think lots of them also found outlets for the more radical work they wanted to be doing in these kind of burgeoning NGOs, for example. Yeah.
Martina?
Thanks, Josh. Thanks, Charlotte. I think it's the same kind of line of questioning around, you know, the more radical side of things. So is there no evidence whatsoever that there is a discussion around aid not as charity but a right, and you know, kind of atoning for the sins of colonialism that actually requires aid in the first place, and all those kind of things? Is there no evidence, or is it just very muted in the documentation?
No, there is evidence of that, and I tried to bring that out a little bit in the talk. So Castle, for example, talks about aid as being a duty that in the 1960s, and actually the creation of the ODM in 1964 is framed as we have a duty to the global south because of Britain's previous role in these countries. And there is a spectrum of ways of talking about that. So, you know, you could have a very kind of soft position on that, which is, you know, we decolonized, now we need to help these countries into independence, or you can be much more radical and say, no, colonialism impoverished these countries and we now need to give them some money to support them. Judith Hart, I think, actually is at the more radical end of that, and certainly Aid and Liberation, which is the book that she writes, is, I think, partly because of the post-Hazelmere context, is really radical, actually, in she's extremely critical of the aid industry and the aid sector. And that's why she makes the call to say, you know, the aid sector is really flawed, but we have to be careful that people in Britain don't use the flaws of the aid sector to sort of justify pulling out from aid entirely, because we have a duty to these countries, because we need to basically give money to these places that we have sort of made suffer during imperialism. And you certainly see that a lot more as well on the more radical kind of levels of supporters as well. So into the 1980s, I think the sorts of people who are engaging more critically with things like Oxfam are people who are sort of saying, you know, Britain did a lot wrong, imperialism, you know, caused a lot of problems to the world, and sort of the CND and stuff like this as well, right? Britain should be a moral leader in the world, but has historically not been, and has historically been not had a positive effect globally. And this is kind of our ability, this is our moment almost to make amends for colonial policy. But actually, because they have the same outcome, you can kind of have all of those things existing in the same space as long as aid is actually being given, right? You can have some people saying colonialism was terrible and we therefore need to give money to these countries because of the deep colonial shame and guilt we have. And you can also have people saying colonialism was stewardship and we just need to help these countries more into decolonization, and, you know, this is just part of one of the many altruistic things Britain has done for Africa since the 19th century or whatever. I think sometimes the ideological disputes actually get slightly flattened by the fact that everyone in that argument agrees money should be given. It kind of flattens some of the distinctions, even though ideologically, of course, they are very different positions. On a practical level, it might come out with the same policies. You might end up with the same kind of policy coming out of that.
Thanks. Great.
We have a second question from Mark, who says, do politicians in the 1960s discuss aid-stroke development more cynically in terms of soft power to increase British influence?
So they do, across both the Conservative Party and to some extent the Labour Party. One of the ways they do this is so in a kind of post-decolonisation moment, British politicians often talk very euphemistically about Britain's kind of expertise. Yeah, a lot of international kind of Britain in the UN, Britain in the FAO, Britain in the World Health Organization talks about itself a lot as having expertise in the developing world. And obviously the expertise Britain has in these spaces is largely one of extraction and exploitation. You know, the expertise it has is colonialism. But because the British practically have connections on the ground, and actually because a very popular career for young colonial civil servants in the 1960s after decolonisation happened was to go and work for the FAO. Right? The FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organisation, employs a vast number of people who had previously been colonial administrators, because it's all people who have experience of doing things like agricultural development projects in Tanzania. So of course they go and work for the FAO. So that means that Britain is therefore even better suited, better able to position itself internationally as having expertise in international development, because so many of the people in these organisations are British and have direct experience of British colonialism. The World Health Organization is the same. Lots of colonial medical officers moved to the World Health Organization afterwards. The United Nations is certainly the same. And so Britain in the 1960s into the 1970s is seen internationally, it's not just Britain saying this, it actually is seen internationally as being a kind of source of expertise about the developing world. And of course, the people in developing nations often are not seen as being a source of expertise about the developing world, right? Their voices are not really listened to in these international organizations. And so it's quite easy for Britain to use that as a space of soft power, particularly in these big organizations. It's easy for Britain to kind of to go from being a colonial power to being a post-colonial power, which is trading on expertise that it developed through colonialism. There's also a real sense in the 60s, I think, that the United States is moving into the developing world and doing it in a very ham-fisted and problematic way. So the Vietnam War is seen by many in Britain as being an example of the fact that the Americans don't know how to deal with this stuff. American kind of attempts to do developments with the creation of USAID in 1960 is received with concern by the British, who are very concerned that America is setting up an aid department. Like, what are they doing with this? Why do they want to give aid? They don't have, and they actually write documents saying, but America has no reason to give aid because it doesn't have an empire. And so American aid must be self-interested. And it completely ignores the fact that British imperialism is also self-interested, right? It says, well, but USAID must be self-interested because they have no empire, so they have no connection, so why are they doing this? And so certainly privately, a lot of foreign aid by both Conservative and Labour Party politicians, but also civil servants, is talked about as a way to make sure the Americans don't move into these spaces, to keep America out of places like Kenya, for example. And then kind of more broadly, yes, they do talk about it, but it's mostly the Conservatives who present aid in that way. So it's publicly, it's mostly the Conservatives and conservative newspapers, right-leaning newspapers, that talk about aid as being about British influence overseas. And you can see this to now. Obviously, the Conservative Party, when Boris Johnson announced the decision to roll DFID up into the FCO, he did so in a speech which talked a lot about aid as soft power. And that's been a fairly consistent Conservative Party policy, I would say, from at least the 1950s onwards.
Okay, we've still got some time for a few more questions. Does anyone got anything they'd like to ask Charlotte?
I think there's another question in the chat, Josh, above Mark's.
Another question in the chat, Josh, from Elliot.
Oh, sorry. Talking of situating Labour as part of an international community and also thinking of socialist internationalism as a broader goal, is there any history of Labour in opposition engaging in constitution with international trade unions, civil society, etc., before or whilst developing their manifesto proposals on development/aid? If not, what extent can we consider the UK left in opposition as in fact promulgating the neo-parliamentarianism that then goes on to denounce when in government?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because I think even the more, so I think there are definitely examples of even the more radical Labour voices being very radical in their ideas about Labour Party, Labour's ability to do development, but very radical in a way that is somehow, again, based on British expertise about what development should look like. And that might be British expertise from a socialist perspective, but it still sometimes does not include the voices of people in in developing economies. That's not completely the case, though. So, for example, I said in the talk that, Dennis Healy does this tour of apartheid South Africa, and part of what he does in that tour is speak to a lot of NGOs, not just in South Africa, but also NGOs in kind of the sort of Southern African region, and talks to, and by NGOs, in that case, I don't mean like white British NGOs, I mean like on the ground NGOs, and talks to them about how kind of the international community could support them more. There's definitely quite a lot of stuff. I know I keep mentioning Barbara Castle, but because Barbara Castle's brother is the first field officer for Africa, and he's quite a long time he's based in Lesotho, and he has a lot of connections, obviously, with again with like NGOs and with Black organisations who are working for economic development, and we know that he's quite influential in getting their voices heard within Oxfam policy, and that probably also kind of shapes into the left more broadly. I think this stuff's often for Labour done at one step removed, so they often work with organisations that themselves are working with people on the ground, rather than Labour kind of going directly into those spaces. Because you mentioned trade unions in your answer, I just want to say one thing I find really interesting about this, which I haven't written about loads yet, is that under Attlee, one of the big colonial development policies that I actually do think is, obviously a lot of the colonial development stuff that happens under Attlee is really about making the African colonies more profitable, and a very obvious example of this is the East African Groundnut Scheme, which is like this huge disaster. And then they build lots of schools and hospitals and things, and arguably this is work they should have been, Britain should have built schools and hospitals in its colonies before this moment, so we shouldn't necessarily praise the Labour government too much for it. One thing that's quite interesting about Labour's post-war policy in its African colonies is it spends a lot of time training African trade unionists and sending British trade unionists out to African colonies in order to unionise the African colonial populations. And they're very proud in 1950 that they've unionised 100,000 African workers. And genuinely, I have not really seen many people write about this, like from a trade union history perspective. And I keep thinking I want to look into it more. And then obviously all of the archives have been closed for a year, so I haven't had the chance I would have liked to. But I think that's really interesting as a development policy, because as a colonial government, the last thing you want is a unionised workforce, right? It makes absolutely no sense as a colonial government to unionise your colonial workforce. And of course, there's lots of kind of complications and contradictions here, because a lot of the colonial workforce is obviously non-urban, and there's a whole thing on the left more generally before the 1940s about like how can you have like a non-proletariat working class in places like does Africa need to go through an industrial revolution, and all of these kind of quite conceptual arguments. And then the Attlee government just sort of quietly sets up lots of trade unions and just sort of starts this policy rolling. And those trade unions become in the 1960s quite important voices for independence movements, and then become quite important kind of post-colonial forces. And I would love to look into that more, but have not that much. But I do think that's quite an interesting example of them actually working with people on the ground to try to like engage with some of these ideas in a more equitable way, maybe.
Alexander.
Yes, this is really a question of curiosity, and I apologize if it's something you mentioned during the few minutes when I had to step out. I wondered, are you aware of any quantitative evidence research that would enable us to demonstrate that foreign aid actually did go up under Labour governments as opposed to Tory governments? I guess interpretation of this data would be difficult because of the different timelines, but it would also be interesting to see whether the non-governmental aid sector grows under Tory governments. So I'm just curious whether you can point me towards some research in that field.
I are they not off the top? So generally speaking, aid spending does tend to be higher under Labour governments, not least because I think the Conservatives would argue inefficiency because they have a separate aid department, right? Because under Labour governments there's a separate aid department. Under Conservative governments, aid is part of the FCO almost entirely from the 1960s onwards. And so aid spending under Labour tends to be higher because, not least because they're running a department, but also because they have much more independence over what they spend money on. Under the Conservatives, increasingly, and this has been a real kind of thing of ODA actually, so the Overseas Development Assistance Commitment to 0.7, what you essentially see is an enormous amount of creative accounting to hit these targets every year of ring-fence spending, and an enormous amount of stuff gets classified as aid spending, which is really questionably not aid. So under George Osborne, Britain hit the 0.7 target for the first time, and most of that is actually because of inflation. Doesn't really reflect a rise in spending. But it's also because Britain contributed to the CSSF, which is the Conflict, Security and something fund, I can't remember the other S, which is all about counterterrorism. It's all about funding counterterrorism initiatives. It's really, thank you, Elliot, stabilisation, which is a proper neoliberal term for this sort of thing. It's all about funding armies, essentially, including some quite unpleasant ones. And so sort of what is classified as aid, it becomes kind of complex and difficult to measure. With charities, it's interesting because obviously you get rises in charitable donations at moments of crisis. The NGO sector gets bigger and bigger in the 1980s, partly I think, as I argued, because people who would have normally been putting, I think, a lot of people in the 1980s just stopped funneling all of their energies into the Labour Party at a moment where the Labour Party is not going to win power, and become increasingly committed to kind of extra parliamentary ideas of global justice, and so start things like Oxfam and stuff just get bigger and bigger in those periods. And you have a kind of mirrored, you have the corporatization of the aid sector in the 1990s and into the 2000s, which is itself really problematic, and people within the aid sector are very, often very torn about this, because the sort of NGOs have more and more money, but have become kind of more and more corporate entities that have less and less radical in what they do. So actually, I think some people in those organisations would be ever so slightly ambivalent about them becoming larger kind of financially, because it doesn't necessarily mean that some people working in them wouldn't necessarily felt they'd stuck to their radical principles, for example. But generally speaking, yeah, aid spending tends to be higher under Labour. And I think it's Jennifer Van Heerder Hudson has done some work on this. She's certainly done quite a lot of work on kind of perceptions of aid spending and things like that, which is all really interesting.
Thank you.
A question from Peter, who says, do we have any indication about how traditional Labour voters rather than members felt about aid?
I think that's a really interesting question, because I think Labour has always struggled to know what its voters think. I think the Conservative Party has often felt more confident in understanding why people vote Conservative. And I think the Labour Party, and I would argue possibly because it has more of a commitment to these quite nebulous morality and duty ideas, actually finds it quite hard when it comes down to it to work out why people vote Labour. And you have this real crisis. And obviously, like in 1959, when Must Labour Lose is published, there's this whole kind of thing in Must Labour Lose where they think in 1959, they go, well, there's no working class in Britain anymore in 1959. The working class doesn't exist anymore because of the welfare state, right? Everyone's affluent now. And no one will ever vote Labour again. that we're doomed, and the book itself is partly you know, in the Must Labour Lose partly is framed around, you know, you need to stick to moral principles. You need to think about kind of core moral principles. And Rita Hindon, who writes the introduction and the conclusion to that book, and who is really active in the Fabian Colonial Bureau, says, you know, what we shouldn't do is change our policies to chase voters, but what we need to do is kind of make sure our principles are a point of clarity, because we can't appeal to people on the idea that, you know, you are poor and voting Labour will make you more comfortable. So we have to work out how to appeal to them on the idea that, like, socialism is good for the country and the world. And so I think when Labour has done well, they've probably managed to sell aid as part of a broader thing, which is, you know, Labour is a party of modernity, of forward thinking, of equality, of global harmony, of social justice. I was really struck that Harold Wilson uses the phrase social justice in his book in 1953, which I think I would have thought was a more modern way of thinking about these things. But so I think when Labour has done well, when Labour has won, it's because it's managed to win people over with an idea that there is something, you know, there are these big principles on which you should vote Labour that don't just come down to, will I get more from my health service or whatever. And in those circumstances, presumably voters therefore kind of bought that and fed into it. I think it's interesting because the British public themselves have quite an ambiguous idea about aid, in that most people generally support the principle of it, and particularly around moments of crisis. If you kind of poll people at moments after kind of big emergency disasters and stuff, obviously their view really changes. It's quite hard to get a kind of stable idea about it. David Hudson at Birmingham has been trying to kind of track general feelings about aid. The thing that comes up over and over again is that British people think we should spend aid overseas, and it's an important sort of element of British policy, but they think that we spend too much money. But that's because British people don't understand what 0.7% of GDP is, and tend to assume it means 7% of GDP, or in some cases on surveys, actually 70% of GDP. So the sort of people think we spend far too much money and think it should be cut. The 70% figure always makes me laugh, because the figure people said we should cut it to is 25%, which I always thought Difford should use this as a, like, you know, people think we should spend 25% of GDP on aid. This is like brilliant research for us. So a lot of people's negative feelings about aid actually come from just a lack of understanding of what that means, which, I mean, is the same as things like, right, when people are very critical of benefit fraud, because the assumption about how much of benefit fraud is that it's this huge percentage of British government spending, and actually it's this tiny amount. And a lot of this critique, I think, comes from concerns about the money rather than actually about what Britain is doing.
Okay, we've got a comment from James. He says, thanks for a great talk, Charlotte. This is more of a comment than a question. On the trade union point, Creech Jones had a long career as a TGWU official before he became an MP. I think he wrote some pamphlets on the TU organising in the 1920s, but not sure if there's any international dimension to them.
He did. He has a really interesting career, Creech Jones. He's imprisoned in the First World War because he's a pacifist and he refuses to fight. So he's sent to prison, and it's when he's in prison, you know, because and his pacifism comes from kind of religious principles. And then when he's in prison, he, as a lot of people did, he reads a lot, right, and he engages a lot with socialism, and he in South London he joins the Labour Party, and the Labour Party that he joined, I've looked at his personal things, and I've seen the little you know, kept in his personal papers all the little programmes of talks and things at his local Labour Party in South London. And it's often in the 1920s and 30s really internationalist topics coming through as well. It's a lot of speakers on pacifism and the coming war, or the international, you know, the League of Nations, or he goes to talks on things like Italy and Abyssinia. He kind of attends all of this sort of stuff. And then he becomes an MP. And he's also the head of the FCB by 1940. So he had, I think you're right. I think that kind of early trade union experience, and obviously he worked really closely with Bevan in his pre-MP role, and he always kind of slightly struggled to get out, I think, from dominance of Ernest Bevan, who he sort of had always been kind of slightly junior to. But I think you're right that there's probably some connections there as well. I think it's interesting that it should be sort of Fabian inflected colonial policy that is so influential in unionizing colonial populations, because I think the Fabians don't have an uncomplicated relationship with trade unionism. So thank you.
It's time for one more question. Is anyone got anything they'd like to ask Charlotte? Martina?
I came in that quick. I was just asking to see whether you can speculate whether you think there is a possibility of a more radical position on the horizon, given where we are in terms of revisiting all the histories of our great statues and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation's position on philanthropy out of exploitation. Do you think there is have you got any thoughts on where Labour might go?
I really hope we could be in that space, both from a sort of NGO perspective and a government aid space, but I think only a government aid space under a Labour government. Not under a Conservative government. But NGOs definitely are obviously all kind of really engaging, with more or less kind of good faith, but are engaging in a kind of decolonising initiative. I was doing some work earlier with the Overseas Development Institute, for example, who are very keen that not only that they should as an organisation kind of embrace this, but also they have an enormous amount of material and archive on site, which they're really keen people should go and look at and use to kind of push this conversation forward. I think COVID as well, actually, because a lot of the conversations around vaccinations and COVID have really kind of, again, heightened this conversation about global inequality. And particularly once, when we get to a point where people in the global north are mostly vaccinated and people in the global south mostly aren't, I think there will be a lot of space there for pushing conversations around this and then kind of global economic recovery after COVID as well. And there's clearly some opportunity for, even things actually like that boat getting stuck in the Suez Canal, right? It led to conversations about global interconnectivity and about why a boat getting stuck in the Suez Canal really is problematic for Britain, because actually of historic trade routes and because of the ways in which our kind of economy works and things like this, that really still affects us in a way that feels quite profoundly imperial. I think the pushback on this from a Conservative government clearly would be, so sort of some of the work I do is more kind of straight imperial history, and the book I'm writing is about how British society has been shaped by imperialism from the Second World War through to kind of present day. And so I've been following and writing about quite a lot of things like the British government's critique of the National Trust recently for their decolonising reports and things, and their Oliver Dowden's announcement that Corin Fowler's colonial countryside will never receive any more government funding because he sees it as being overly critical of the government and things like this. And whilst we have this Conservative government in place, which seems to be very, very committed to pursuing this sort of culture war, I think any conversations around aid and duty, this is all going to get kind of brought into these the broader conversations about why should Britain feel responsible for its colonial past? Why should people have to apologise for things that they didn't do? Why should, the British feel guilty for colonial history and things like this? And I think it's really difficult to have conversations about aid spending in any radical way, whilst that's a dominant government position. Because you need to come from that position that there's some sort of duty rooted in the fact that colonialism was exploitative. And at the moment we have a government which is really, really determinedly committed to the idea that saying anything negative about imperialism at all is bizarrely whitewashing history, but also, like doing Britain down or, attacking Britain's great British history or whatever. So it's going to be really difficult, I think, to push it in a more radical direction while that is the case.
Okay, just to wrap things up, Charlotte, that was an excellent paper about Labour, the development of policies around aid, but also the consistency of policy and values. I think it's well worth remembering that across decades. I think we had a really good discussion afterwards as well. So many, many thanks. I know Duncan would have loved it. So you've done him proud. So thank you very much for that. We got there in the end, despite all the technical difficulties. All the problems, but it was well worth the rerun, so thank you again, and we hope to see you here in Bangor very soon, or certainly at some stage in the near future. So thanks to Charlotte, thanks also to Joshua, long-suffering Joshua and Neris in helping to organise it a second and successful time. So thank you to everyone. And thanks for everybody who attended as well. I think we had a really good discussion, as I say, at the end there. So Charlotte, we hope to see you soon. And once again, thank you so much. And everybody else, have a very good evening. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I'm sure you did. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.